Welcome everyone to IFAB 2020. In the real world, we'd be saying that this is the last day and you'd all be exhausted and getting ready to get on airplanes and trains and in cars and things and go home. But the good news is that the videos that you've been watching over the last 3 days, and with still more to go, are going to be available forever. And we feel so excited that we've been able to produce an amazing series of expert conversations and information which will live on, because culture doesn't change, even if specific things in the world do change. So welcome to the online version of this. So we have a whole panel of experts. Craig Pollard is going to be our moderator today. Please feel free to ask as many questions as you can. And on behalf of Chaplain York, thank you so very much for being a part of this. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope you found it really useful. And we hope you will continue to refer to this really brilliant amount of information that we've been able to show over the last 3 days. So I'm going to turn over to Craig Pollard, your moderator for this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I'm joining you from a tatami room on the island of Okinawa in southern Japan. And it's great to see so many of our experts here right now from all corners of the world. I've personally really enjoyed the specialist sessions today that have literally zoomed in on some of the biggest challenges facing global fundraisers today and have offered helpful insight and practical solutions. So I think which are relevant wherever you are and whatever your cause. We're here now in the Q&A to dive even deeper into what you want to talk about, and I'd encourage you to use the next hour to ask your most difficult questions of our panelists. Please use the Q&A tab on Chaplain York's Connect, or send them to Anna Brennan and I'll ask them on your behalf, and forgive me for paraphrasing or adding in specifics. And if possible, please do direct your questions to individual speakers. Those that are more general will be put out to everybody. So let's go straight in with the first question. Martin, I'm going to dive straight in with a tough question related to arts and culture. Many arts and heritage organizations depend on visitors, and they've had a huge hit this year. What should fundraisers working in these institutions focus on during the next 12 to 18 months?
Yes, they have had a huge hit, but it depends what you mean by visitors, because while there has been an enormous reduction in particular, performing arts, but also to a great extent in museums and galleries, there has been a gigantic explosion of new visitors online. And I think that you have to therefore redefine the concept of visitor. And all organizations are trying to do this. And I think arts and cultural organizations have been spectacular in being creative and looking at ways of not only putting their existing product online, but on actually developing new lines of engagement. In the UK in particular, I think the emphasis has been on engaging with existing supporters rather than overcomplicating things while looking at new supporters. But one good example is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's had I don't know what the statistic, but an absolutely global expansion of people looking at its operas. And across the board, I think that's something that has really got to be looked at. However, there will be people who are desperately keen to be going to the theatre, to going to opera, to going to art galleries. In the UK, we've had in and out of the ability to do that, and the same applies to lots of other countries. In fact, I'd say most countries. And I think this is a key time for development of fundraising to engage with marketing and communications, and in particular with front of house, to actually make sure that everybody is really, really welcomed. And my experience is that this is really, really happening. So that everybody who comes into the door in an organization should be seen as a potential or existing donor and supporter. If you treat them like that from the moment they come in, I think we've actually got a lot of good things happening in the future. I can talk about, in general, about COVID. I would say I've answered this question in my session this morning. I don't think the arts and cultural sector will get back to anything like normal until until summer and probably autumn of 2021. But what is normal? I think we will learn from this experience to create hybrid forms of engagement. That's good, that's not bad. We don't have to go back to the old things. Donors are increasingly enjoying a different way of engaging with people. I can talk about that in more length.
Okay,
that's
great.
it.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Nancy, would you like to add something to that?
Yes, just yesterday, I was really privileged to be in on a video where an arts and heritage organization took people on a virtual view of one of their properties and talked about it and that they look after, etc. And actually, in some ways, it was really better than I would have been able to have done if I had just sort of wandered over there. So I learned more and I got closer to it. I got to see the bits in the basement and all that. The only thing I would have said about it is that they really needed to ask more at the end of it to say, get in your pocket now and give us some money. So there are ways, whilst these things are happening, when people can't go visit things, that are that should be thought of to a way of bringing what your assets to the world, and people are really taking advantage of that, and brilliantly done. So all good stuff.
Daniel, you made your point during your session that in the future, everything will be expected to include a virtual option, whether it's a campus tour, impact report, meeting, etc. And you gave some useful examples of how to do this. To what extent do you think we'll have to transition back to sort of a real life funding?
Yes, I was interested. Martin made the same point about mixed mode will become standard, we expect. When we get back to real events, of course, we'll work on each place. We work across Australia and New Zealand is almost post-COVID. Things are back to normal. And it's very strange dealing with, we're still on some restrictions, but they are under almost none. And it's interesting to see there how quickly life got back to normal and how quickly people dropped virtual events. I think the experience will be different for places that have virtual and have lockdown for longer than New Zealand. I don't know that New Zealand's experience is going to be typical, but I think there are great opportunities, particularly for cutting out the travel, so that engagement of our senior people, vice chancellors, museum directors, etc., can now engage around the world. It will be acceptable not to travel. So I think we need to learn how to take advantage of those things.
I think we've got a question here. How can, so thinking about the current situation about, this may be one for you, James, about sort of digital, etc., is how can we change the thought processes of challenging boards from the mentality that fundraisers are there to help them and to have more traditional views, to them sort of practically helping the fundraisers and adopting new technologies and investing in new areas?
Yeah, I guess, boards and convincing boards and taking them along for the journey with new trends. Of course, that's something I know a lot of people deal with in our sector. Look, you know, for me, it comes back to data, you know, and boards are ideally, you know, everyone on a board or a lot of people on a board are, you know, data-driven decision makers. They're looking for evidence on which to base, you know, decisions for investment and things like that. So, yeah, for me, it comes back to making the strongest argument based on data, you know, so you can show that it's actually a strategic argument. Yeah, that's really it just comes back to that, you know, building the strongest case.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on that? Magdalena?
Boards can be invaluable, especially when it comes to major gift fundraising or relationship-based fundraising. And to make the relationship with the board overall and board members individually successful, there are a number of key things that charities and other organizations need to make sure that they're getting right. Number one, that's to have a strong chair, somebody who can really mobilize the rest of the board, and somebody who has the support of the CEO and the rest of the organization, so that fundraising, so that it's clear that fundraising is a big part of the strategic objectives of the organization. Number two, to have a clear role for individual board members and a clear remit of the board overall. And in that, it has to be explicit whether members are expected to contribute financially themselves or to also be influencing gifts from, let's say, their organization or other organizations on your behalf. This is something that we spoke about a lot at the live Q&A session yesterday, and it seems it is a concern for a lot of organizations. And somebody else had a very interesting, very helpful point to add to that as well, is that it helps to have term limits for board members, whether it's 2 years or 3 years, so that they know that the effort is very focused and they know that this is their opportunity to make an impact.
And staggering them as well so that they don't all leave at the same time. Nancy, we have a question on tax. Thank you, Magdalena. Do you see tax benefit opportunities around the world growing over time, with other territories catching up on tax efficient giving, like those in the UK and US? Or do you think that it's a static situation? And where do you think are the territories to really watch that are making progress in this area?
Gosh, that's a way of looking a bit silly without knowing everything about every tax jurisdiction. I think what I would say is that they change on a regular basis, because obviously tax effective giving means that governments aren't getting money from people who are giving. Sweden got rid of their tax deductions a couple of years ago, and everybody's been fighting to get them back. Obviously, in the UK, gift aid is a benefit to the charity, with a very tiny benefit to the donor, whereas in the US, for example, or even Hong Kong and Singapore, even huge donations for local gifts. So I think the answer to that is that it changes. I don't think they are necessarily growing. A government might decide that they want to encourage some particular thing, for example, giving to health or whatever, and so they really encourage donations by making it better tax effective giving. The other thing I would say is that there's usually a huge difference between giving locally and giving internationally. And that's the thing, if we're talking about international giving, where even when there's local tax benefits, often those tax benefits just evaporate when the donation leaves the country. And there's really very few countries that are very generous about their international gifts, and particularly, in the West rather than in, for example, Asia.
Okay, great.
Did that answer it?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult and very broad question, but I think you answered it perfectly. So I've got one here for Stephen and James. Maybe Stephen, you can kick off. What are your suggestions about which merchants to use? Some donors in countries prefer specific merchants, or just one merchant. Is it short-sighted to use just PayPal or Stripe plugins? Any tips for merchants to always use in countries outside of the UK? I'm assuming we're talking payment merchants here.
Yes, yeah, sure. I mean, I think for me, the learning that I've taken from working on a lot of global campaigns is you really have to be market specific, and you have to do your research, and you have to figure out what's the norm for people giving in those countries. So in the UK, it's direct debit for regular giving. It's credit cards for one-off donations. That context changes depending on the country that you're in, and so you really just have to make it easy for the donors to give. You have to make it familiar, and obviously there are like new ways to pay all the time. PayPal's growing in certain countries, so just keeping track of that and seeing what traction you get when you introduce it. It's a lot of work to introduce new payment methods as well, I would say. So it's really got to be worthwhile. You've got to do your research and make sure that it's worth the effort of your development teams to go through all the compliance and the testing to make sure. So that would be my answer for that. Yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. James, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's a really good answer. We're working with organisations across Europe and in the States, and yet even between European countries, the norms and what people use are incredibly different. They're just totally different systems. So yeah, the local knowledge there is really important. And I'd also say, you know, keep mobile in mind, and ease of mobile transactions. And that comes with, you know, the types of payments that you're offering, whether you're offering Google and Apple Pay and things like that. And also just the interaction with the form. So this year, Stephen, I'm actually not sure with Animals Asia, but with some other organisations we work with, we've actually seen the proportion of donations coming via desktop versus mobile flip this year, and it's at least with some organisations, it's mobile first, which is a huge flip. And for what I've been seeing, this isn't, you know, it's not necessarily universal, but from what I've seen, this has really been the first year that I've really seen that consistently. So keep that in mind, and that trend is going to continue, I think. Stephen, do you have any? Has that happened with Animals Asia as well?
It has, yeah, and I think part of that is to do with the channels that we're using as well. So we're doing a lot of advertising on Facebook, and obviously people use their mobiles to browse on Facebook. So bear in mind that when people land on your website, think about where they've come from. A lot of the traffic now is coming from mobile, and therefore you'll need to be optimized for mobile. And as James says, Apple Pay, Google Pay is essential for that, just to make it a seamless experience. You know, people are so busy these days. If they can do stuff at one touch, one click, then that's perfect.
Actually, following on from that question, there's another one about how so some small organizations are wary about how and how much they might need to invest in Facebook advertising and other social media platforms to get started. How would you convince trustees and finance department that paying Facebook is actually worth it? I guess that's again to James.
Yeah, I'll kick off, James, if that's cool with you. I think, again, coming back to a previous answer that James mentioned, that it's going to be all about data. So do a small test, try and put a business case together. You know, use conservative estimates of response rates and average gifts, so you're not over-promising too much. The great thing about Facebook is that you can spend a relatively small amount and get a good read on how things look in terms of response rates and whether stuff works. Do your research on your audience. Do your research on your targeting. If you can, share data with Facebook so it can build really strong audiences for you. You know, develop some really strong creative, do a small test and check the return on investment, check the number of new donors that you bring in, check the engagement that you get on your website. All of those metrics will be useful for convincing your board to invest more money in, I would say.
Great. Okay, thank you. Let's we'll just move back to another session. We've had one for Stuart and Daniel. I wonder if Stuart, you could kick off with this. Can you expand on your tips, and if they apply equally to other levels and types of education, given that I think your focus was on higher education? How relevant are they, and how would you sort of adjust them to work in other levels of education?
Greetings from the US now. So thanks, Craig, for the question. Yeah, I think what Daniel and I tried to focus on in our session was to try to be consistent that our tips would be relevant across the board as much as possible. Yes, of course, they were focused on higher education, but secondary schools as well certainly would be valued on this. The tips really, I think, focus more on the importance of understanding that some things have changed and are certainly changing due to this year and the pandemic, but other core historical ways of how one does fundraising across borders or even not across borders don't change and haven't changed. And there needs to be an understanding of what some of the things that aren't changing that are really important, as well as others. So for example, if one is really considering fundraising across borders, planning and creating a good understanding of the geographic area where you want to fundraise is going to go a long way to helping you develop your action plan. I did a short video yesterday also on some tips that really focused in on the value of having your case really focused in well on where you want to fundraise and taking into consideration cultures and norms, and giving opportunities and vehicles, etc. and making sure that your action plan was very specific and focused in on where you want to fundraise. So those tips, I think, are relevant and make sense regardless of whether and how your organization, your institution. One other thing, and then I'll stop because I realized that a lot of questions. And I just wanted to go back to quickly on something Craig, you and Magdalena talked about boards. With regards to higher education, oftentimes board members can be very, very important with regards to major gift fundraising, like you said. And if they're not necessarily giving, but they can open up doors in some really, really important ways. The kinds of things that are changing based upon the pandemic, and now we're going to be used technology and Zoom calls, those kinds of roles and responsibilities can be maintained in really important ways, not just face-to-face. In fact, it's probably going to make it easier to engage them in helping to open doors, develop prospect lists with you, identify potential supporters.
Okay, great. Daniel, do you have anything to add to that?
I think there is some fundamental differences about the cases for support for higher education and schools. Both of them can appeal to personal experience, alumni affinity, impact on the local region, etc. But universities and higher education have this substantial difference that they make a difference in all kinds of areas of the world, and thus they can attract people who may have no personal history with the institution. I think it's possible for schools to do this, but they usually are not very good at it. They can make a case about their contribution and the importance of girls' education, their contribution for developing leaders of tomorrow, etc., and thus reach a philanthropic audience beyond their alumni and parents and former parents. But they need to be better at it, usually.
Okay, thank you. We've had a question about the chicken and egg situation of setting up a UK charity. One about a bank account and when you register with a commission, but and I think there's quite a standard process. We've had it a number of times actually coming through, and there's the relatively standard process for setting up a UK charity. I think it is as there is in the US, in Australia, New Zealand, etc. And I think there's some very clear guidance actually on the Charity Commission website, and also if you I think there are a lot of resources online, so I'd encourage people to look online. And also I would say that there's been a lot of interesting great slides today from the presentation, so I just want to let you all the attendees know that all of the speakers are going to put their slides on to their own profiles, so that they'll all be available after this session. And Nancy, I'm sure you have something else to add.
Sorry, you can't trust a lawyer to keep quiet. The one thing I would say before you start going through setting up a UK charity is whether you actually need your own UK charity, or whether, for example, membership with something like the Chapel in York UK Foundation would give you what you need, which is access to gift aid and a presence in the country. And that's true of a lot of countries. Do you need your own entity, or are you going to spend more time stewarding the board and dealing with the legal things, when really what you want is a way to get the money tax effectively? So that would be what I would add to that question.
Right. And also the question is, if you're based in the UK, whether you actually need to be a registered charity. If you can register as a social enterprise or a CIO, there are a lot more creative options, and I think this is something we're seeing particularly over the last decade, around the change in how causes and good causes are financed in these more mature markets, and there's a whole range of sort of different sorts of investment going in to different sorts of organizations. So we have another question. This is another one for Martin. So future donations, talking about macro trends in future donations that are likely to shift further from sort of past focused organizations, maybe museums, etc., to more future focused causes like climate change, educational, social justice. How are arts and cultural institutions adapting to these shifts in giving?
I would challenge the idea that they are past focused. I have worked with, for instance, archaeology organizations, and one of them is saying archaeology is about the present, not the past. It's about how we define ourselves in relation to the perception of the past to go forward. And I think there's the whole issue of Black Lives Matter, the whole issue of climate change, the whole issue about inequality is invigorating and enveloping all cultural organizations, certainly in the Western world, not necessarily in areas like China. And so I don't think the issue is past or future. I think any organization, cultural organization, that is really seriously thinking about being sustainable is thinking about now and tomorrow, and how the stories they can tell aren't the stories about the past as such, but there's the stories that will enliven the citizens of the future, in particular young people, to actually go forward and actually change the world. So I think the debate is different from the way it's just been articulated, actually.
And I think one great example, I think, is the Natural History Museum in London, which is sort of evolved from being this sort of very dusty old place full of dead things to being a much more outward-looking, future-focused institution, very successful in their fundraising and communications.
Absolutely.
So this is something maybe for Stephen and James. This is about dormant Google grants. There's a dormant Google grant. This question is about, and don't really know how to use and don't give it that much attention. Would you recommend giving more time and effort, or outsourcing it to help drive traffic to the website and help kickstart a digital campaign?
Stephen, I think you could speak to your experience this year on that.
Yeah, we when I took over, we pretty much had a dormant Google grant that we weren't using at all. They are really labor intensive, and they're quite technical. You need to know what you're doing with Google Ads. We quickly outsourced it to Mindwise. We gave them some briefs about what we wanted to achieve. They manage all of that on our behalf. We're now spending the full amount every month. We're driving loads more traffic. There is obviously fees, agency fees for that, but for us it's worth it. It's washing its face in terms of donations. So yeah, if you've got a dormant Google grant and you don't know where to start, I can recommend Mindwise and or any of your digital agencies that do Google Ads. It's definitely worth doing, because it's $10,000 of free search advertising that you can get every month. So yeah, it's just very labor intensive is what I would say for that. Yeah.
I'll add a couple of points to that. Yeah, and just to reinforce what Stephen's saying, it really is an area of expertise. I've also worked on the charity side and tried to manage a Google Grant account myself, amongst 100 other things, and with it not really being my specific area of expertise. And the people that you want working on Google AdWords are people who do that. Who specialize in that, because it is very technical and specific. It's not like Facebook advertising. It's totally different. Another important point for everyone to understand is if it's dormant, meaning you're not really doing much with it, but you've got it, it will get deregistered. Google will do that if you're not using it and actively managing it, and that does happen. And when it happens, it's a real pain to get back. They make you jump through hoops. So yeah, just be aware of that. It will get removed. And then I think just an important thing, and this is for everyone to understand, one of the reasons why we're able to spend Animals Asia's grants, full grant amount, is that they've got rich content and landing pages, which we're further working with them to refine, but they've got content related to search that comes through at high volume. And so we're able to tie those things together. So ads, it's not a push medium like Facebook ads where you can just serve whatever you want to people. If you want traffic, you need to align good content that's designed for it and landing pages that are then going to push people to convert. And then your ads and the keywords and ad groups need to align with that. So it's part of an ecosystem. It's not just an ad platform on itself.
Great, thank you. Stuart, going back to yours and Daniel's session, you mentioned the importance of institutions focusing their case for support on global relevance and impact. How can a fundraiser or a fundraising team practically flex their messaging and case for support without appearing whimsical?
Whimsical. Ah, I like that word. Yes. Yeah, I think I'll use an example of what we're seeing in the United States in terms of how prospects and donors are seeking for ways to really have their philanthropy make a difference, and how universities and multi-focused institutions can really be responsive to what we're seeing in the philanthropic landscape. I think what you're referring to in terms of whimsical is maybe shifting or changing, possibly based upon the whims of what might be a donor, et cetera. I think it's really, really important for institutions in education to make sure they're playing off of their strengths and are being as creative as possible in terms of crafting cases that reflect how the university can move the needle in some really important ways. And I think obviously the larger universities can do that better because they have the diversity of skill sets, et cetera. But the development office and fundraisers, I think, can actually play an important role in this by reflecting back what they're hearing from the donor community as well. So I'm a big proponent of having fundraisers engaged in helping to develop cases, because they, in a lot of ways, can be reflective of what they're hearing about what people care about. So I think it's not a sort of a cut and dry kind of a thing. And I think the cases in many ways can reflect not just what they're hearing on the ground, but also the strengths of the university, and then come up with a way that can be very responsive to prospects and donors. In many ways, at least, let's just talk about major gifts for a second. You're really starting the process and learning about what a prospect or donor really cares about. And then you're sort of bringing them along to express an interest in how the university can really address something that they care about. And by the time later down the road, when there's a discussion about a gift and really how that gift can be utilized in some important way, that's at the 30,000 foot level. Then you're really talking about the nuts and bolts. And by that time, you hope that the relationship is much closer, and a discussion can be how that gift can best be applied on the ground.
Okay, great, thanks. Magdalena, I thought you might weigh in here. You had got a piece on your session about this, please.
Building on Stuart's point, the best fundraising programs and fundraising initiatives that I've worked on in higher education and other sectors have made sure that as part of the case development process, they have involved all of their stakeholders and audiences and have solicited input that then has helped to shape the case for support. And then another essential element of the case development process, it's standard to develop key messaging that's tailored for the specific audiences. So you need to be very clear who these are. And this would also apply to international audiences. So you need to understand them through that consultation or survey that you have conducted, and then tailor the messaging of your overall umbrella case for support to these audiences.
Okay, thank you. We've had a question specifically for Palestine. Has anyone else fundraised in Palestine? No? Okay, then I'll take this one. Okay, so cultural organizations, well, many organizations are facing big new barrier in the question. This is the question in accepting donations, and that is because of the political conditioning on funding. So USAID, EU, etc., Arab UAE funds, because of normalizing relationships with Israel. And is it safe to say, the question says that, is the next safest option targeting high net worth individuals? How would you go about it? Any leads or resources? Well, I'd say, I think there are huge major gift opportunities in Palestine, but I do think that there's a sort of, it's been happening for 20 years. There's a sort of one-way shift in global overseas development assistance for across the board. and that is only going down. So I think diversifying income in places like Palestine, across the Middle East, across Asia and Africa, I think there's a necessity to diversify. And I don't think I've visited a country, and I've worked in a lot of countries where there are not major gift opportunities, whether that's in Zimbabwe, Myanmar, Costa Rica, across the board. I've never come across a country yet without a significant major gift potential, and I'd say that is something that adds flexibility to any giving portfolio. And I think that particularly somewhere like Palestine, but also I think politically aligned countries, I think there's a lot of money there too, and I'm happy to sort of talk offline to talk specifics about that as well. Martin, do you have something to add there?
Yes, I would just say that for Palestine in particular, but also for many other countries, don't just look at inside, look at the diaspora. The Palestinian diaspora is significant, widespread and influential and often affluent, but the same goes for other organizations. So I think when you look at the issue of challenging methods of donating and receiving donations, don't just look inside a country, look outside too.
Magdalena, did you have something else to add to that, or do you agreeing with Martin?
I absolutely agree with Martin, and what I also wanted to add to that was I was working, did some work for a university in Palestine more than 10 years ago now, and it was specifically to provide training for their fundraising staff on major gift fundraising, and just to say that we know that the success of major gifts fundraising is also dependent on how mature the sector and how professionalized the sector in the country is. And sometimes these two things are a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, but there are absolutely opportunities, and the diaspora would be a natural starting point. I agree with Martin.
I would also like to put a word of warning in there about diaspora fundraising, is that it is not easy, and there are all sorts of feedback mechanisms from the local community to overseas communities. So you have to be delivering the impact, and that these are oversubscribed audiences. They are asked for everything in terms of charitable projects within a country. So targeting within. It's not a monolithic audience of diaspora. You have to target within the diaspora as well, and make sure that your targeting is based on value, by why they value the work that you're doing. So this is another question is a process of drafting my case for support. I've been looking at other examples. Some are really long and detailed, some are short and pithy and more of a summary. Which would you recommend that this person goes for?
Just say that you might never use your case for support in the form in which you've agonized over for months and consulted and had lots of input. Remember, ultimately it gets used for the particular donor. The great thing about a case for support is it forces an institution to make decisions about what it is, what it stands for, what it's trying to do, and what its projects are. But then you speak to the individual donor, matching up their interests with what you are trying to do. So process is really important for getting people on board. Think of it as a well of information from which you will draw and tailor specific documents carefully crafted for individual donor families and institutions.
Yes, Magdalena.
I fully agree with Daniel. In my experience, one of the main uses of the case for support, or this big master document that tells the overall story, tells your donors what the recognition opportunities are, etc. The main purpose of that document is to give your leaders, your leadership group, both internally and externally, confidence. And then what happens in most cases is that gets put to bed, and almost inevitably you start developing companion pieces or specific tailored proposals for your donors, or indeed for the specific elements of the case for support.
And I would add to that, ask your donors. Have conversations with them about what their expectations are. Martin.
Yes, I would say on top of everything else that Dermot and Magdalena have said, is that the case for support, never mind how big or small, is also a fantastic way to engage prospects without asking. So actually using it as an investigation tool to say, okay, this is what my organization thinks they should do. What do you think? So you're actually using it as a warming up device. So it doesn't really matter about how long or how small, so long as the person who is engaged actually has the time to read it. That's it.
Yes, great. Thank you, Martin. Stuart?
Just one final point on that. I think it's very important as one works on the case that you also focus in on how philanthropy is actually going to change something for your organization, and be clear about that. It's just not about what you're going to do and the importance that you have, but really focus in on, if funds are raised, what's going to change.
Great, thank you, Stuart. And I guess I'd like to bring Stephen and James into this, because a digital version of your case support is not quite enough for PDF. This needs to be a very different approach. I wonder if you can speak to sort of the process for developing effective cases.
Again, I think it depends on your organizational context and kind of what the ways of working that you've developed in that organization. Animals Asia, it was quite informal. We did the numbers, we got the testimonials, and we presented it to the fundraising director, who said okay. But there may be a more formalized process for your organization. I think it is all dependent on the context, really.
Okay, great. I think this is one for Daniel. Australia and New Zealand, who have had some good success in dealing with COVID, do you see the fundraising climate there recovering quicker than elsewhere in the world?
It has already recovered in New Zealand. We've had some large projects there, and multi-million-dollar decisions have been made over the last 3 weeks. It's back to business. Australia is well behind that in terms of people returning to decision making, except in health area, of course, where there are very strong contributions being made at the moment. Some of the changes are in staffing. I mean, people are not moving jobs. Many fundraising offices have been downsized, particularly in higher education. Higher education, in fact, more than any other sector. And institutions will find it hard to grow their staff again after having done that. There was a shortage of fundraisers before. It'll be even harder. One of the things that is happening is that Australia and New Zealand import a lot of fundraisers, mostly from the UK, a little bit from the US, and of course nobody's done that this year, and that's probably going to stay right through at least end of next year. So less movement of fundraisers, harder recruitment of fundraisers at home. Perhaps this will be a chance to sort of grow local talent more so, but it will be harder to draw from the depth of experience that people usually bring with them.
Okay, thank you. I guess everyone's talking about the post-COVID era and what that looks like. Nobody really knows, but can we sort of talk about what that might look like? And this is a question: is it a good time now for organizations to take a really hard look at themselves and their fundraising? The answer is probably yes, but the question is, it's such a daunting task reaching into the unknown. Where would you suggest to begin when you start looking at your organization and thinking about your priorities?
I've got several clients who've had big problems right now, secondary education and culture, but they've looked beyond that right now to recruiting and planning for the future. And I think, therefore, the issue is the question of leadership. If the institutional leadership, if the board leadership can look beyond the immediate situation and say what's going to happen at the end of 2021 and 2022 and 23. So I think long-term planning and long-term thinking in the leadership, at the leadership level, is absolutely critical. So if we haven't got that, I think you will be stuck in the problem of survival. But if you can convince your CEOs and your chairs and your board, if they're not already convinced, that the way to get out of this really successfully and to learn the lessons of this crisis is to plan for the other side of the hill. I talk about the sunny uplands on the other side of the hill. That's the way to go forward, but you have to do it with your leadership.
Right. Stuart.
Yeah, I mean, it's along the same theme. Something Daniel said in our session was, consider this sort of an Uber moment. It really is, from the educational standpoint, a sort of a sobering time to look at how much you invest in your fundraising and globally and doing your international fundraising, and how things are going to change going forward. In academia, oftentimes we try to project, or organizations try to project years in advance about what they think they're going to raise. And that is the most difficult thing to do right now. But it's going to be critical that that organizations think very carefully about what they believe they can raise in different geographic markets globally. They're going to have to do that. One way to do that is you could begin to tap into expertise that you have at your organization, if you are a university or higher education, and begin to try to tap into resources that maybe you didn't before in support of your advancement and development functions.
Thank you, Stuart. Does anyone else? Daniel, and then I'll come on to you, James.
I think there are four parts of fundraising, and when professional fundraisers get together, we really only cover the two of them. We cover in person as we do, and online, and the overlap between those. And there've been great sessions on both of those throughout the conference. But there are two others. One is the philanthropist-initiated giving, and we are seeing in Australia some huge and amazing examples of that recently. Bold plans to be able to put out bushfires in the country within an hour from their starting, huge investments, which are philanthropist initiated, for example, but also people going direct and giving directly or seeking funds directly, cutting charities out. Charities are not in the loop. Professional fundraisers are not in the loop. If I've got a need, I'll find someone to fund it online without any assistance from anybody else. So we need to be careful that we really may just be dealing with two of the quarters, and there are two other quarters in the whole picture that don't always get enough attention.
Yeah, I think I basically just wanted to give another shout out to the data and the data-led decision making. I think when we're talking about where to start with planning for the next few years and for the future, making decisions. So when I'm thinking about the charity context, and we're making decisions about resourcing, activities, channel mix, I think if 2020 has taught us anything, it's that we really don't know what's around the corner, and we can't really predict trends. And the best thing to do is to just keep an eye on the data, keep an eye on what's happening and be responsive to it.
Yes, Magdalena, please.
I wanted to add to what Martin was saying about the importance of positioning your organization for success once the economic recovery does arrive, whether that's at the end of 2021 or beyond. And to do that, it's going to be crucial to keep engaging with your donors, because we know many studies have told us that the number one reason donors stop giving is not because they can't afford it, but because they don't feel connected to the organization anymore, whether that's because you've stopped communicating with them or you're not doing it in the right way, in the way that they would expect you to.
Okay, thank you. Yes, James.
I just had one further point that Magdalena made me think about. A lot of that's kind of a further point to what I was saying. A lot of organisations this year that we've worked with or seen closely assumed that they shouldn't fundraise during COVID because the whole market is feeling so much pain. The ones that didn't make that assumption and tried things and responded to the results they got, had windfalls, serious windfalls this year. People gave a lot this year. And Animals Asia, for example, was one of those that did responsive campaigning, responding to what is relevant and happening for people right now in the market, which is COVID, and did really, really well. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I think this is another one maybe for Stephen and James. You talk a lot in your session about smaller donations and sort of pipelines, etc. I was wondering about the major gifts and how digital that you're seeing now is being leveraged to engage major donors, where fundraisers are maybe more used to face-to-face relationships and less comfortable with the technology, etc.
I mean, I can give you some examples of how we've been doing at Animals Asia. We're very, very fortunate to have really good access to our programs. And what we've been doing is webinars for our major donors and mid-value donors. And that's with the directors of the bear rescue sanctuaries. So in China, if people have an interest in China, we'll run one with the head vet there. We have a similar operation in Vietnam. It's like a behind the scenes one-to-one chat. There may be sort of 10, 15 donors in there. So they're getting a really sort of personal experience. They're really, really well subscribed to. We're very lucky that our speakers are super engaging, super passionate. So yeah, just use digital to connect your donors to what you're doing. It's not really rocket science. Just give them that kind of behind the scenes access, and the money will come in. And
the major donors are willing to engage now in this way, because historically they've been very reluctant to in many cases.
Yeah, and I think there was a real concern at Animals Asia that the major giving income would take a hit because we couldn't have those face-to-face conversations and events. But we've managed to find a gap with the webinars that have worked really, really well. And donors understand the situation. They understand that it's going to be slightly different. So you just adapt and you innovate and try stuff, test stuff, and see what works.
And I think that's a great sort of lesson about not making assumptions as well, and listening to donors who are just as flexible, and maybe the assumptions we have as fundraisers are not quite up to speed with what donors are looking for. So continuing those conversations and those lines of communication as things change. Stuart, I saw your hand up there.
Yes, I just wanted to make a quick comment after what James was talking about data. I totally agree. Regardless of your sector, it's now easier than ever to utilize data in terms of developing your prospect lists and accessing information on on high net worth individuals in ways that you really couldn't do in years past. Utilizing services online, etc. So that's becoming is going to have to be much more of a friend of organizations going forward in being much more targeted and getting high quality data in terms of generating your prospect lists.
It's come up a few times about influencing board. But people aren't strictly logical, and showing data, even great data, doesn't always convince people. We've already all banged our heads on this before. And you need to consider how boards learn. And often they learn from peers. So having someone come in from a board of an organization that they respect, preferably with data, is often an important thing. There's a great US study 5 or 6 years ago called The Strange Type of Underdeveloped, and there was a similar study here a year or two later showing the dysfunction between board, CEO and fundraisers. And that's really important for people who want to influence boards about fundraising.
Thank you. I think we're nearing the end of our time, so I just want to open this up to all of the panelists here, just to say, if you had sort of one thing that you want to share in sort of 30 seconds each with the audience, what would that be? So can we start? Who'd like to kick off?
Don't set up an organization in another country unless you really know that you have to have one. There are other options, and investigate them all.
Martin.
Do things in a way you haven't done before. I'm a supporter of English touring opera. I got a postcard on a Saturday morning after the operas had been cancelled by the director. I'd never spoken to him before. I didn't even know who he was. It was a wonderful postcard. On Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, the opera singer who was in the opera rang me up to say, "How am I?" She didn't ask, "How am I?" I had a conversation. I said, "What do you need?" Great, great stewardship.
Mine would be talk to your donors now more than ever. Find out what how they like to be engaged, because they're going on the journey at the same time that we as fundraisers are as well. And I think involve them and open those lines of communication and have honest. I think now is the time you can have more honest and frank conversations with donors than ever before.
Great.
Stuart.
Yeah, that's terrific. I would just say two things. One, spend this time planning for the future. Plan as best you can in crafting an action steps for your international fundraising, regardless of your organization, and spend time engaging with senior leadership. And two, as fundraisers, for all the fundraisers who are on this call, make sure that you are doing what you can to take your expertise and your relationships to bear to your organization during the planning process, because you have a lot of wisdom that can be engaged and put into the plan in very creative ways.
All right, thank you, Stuart. Yes, Magdalena.
To add to those excellent points, when it comes to international fundraising, make sure that yes, you have a plan, but also that you have the commitment of your organization for the longer term, that it's not just a one-off or a stop and start scenario, because as it was mentioned yesterday in one of the sessions, it can really damage relationships for the longer term. And number two, I was going to say, again, building on the previous point, that right now is a great way to be involving your donors and keeping them informed in terms of how your organization is repositioning itself for success after COVID. So now is a great time to be getting their opinion on, are you focusing on the right things? Would they see themselves involved in your future plans and fundraising as well?
Perfect, thank you. Anybody else with a quick? Yes, please, James.
Yeah, sure. So I'm speaking more to fundraisers who are in the sort of lower level, lower tier mass market fundraising. But and of course I'm thinking about digital because that's my role. And what fundraisers need to know is that digital really is a long-term play. If you're not already investing in it, really consider that, because you need some momentum to get going and get significant results. And also just be agile. With digital, you can test small with low budget, then roll out based on your results. So if you're looking internationally, consider light testing of different propositions, different creative tactics in different markets, and then make further decisions from there.
Daniel?
My experience is there's quite a lot to learn about international fundraising and what you do and what you need to do differently. But the really great thing is all those lessons learned are equally applicable at home and make you a better fundraiser at home.
Great, thank you. Stephen?
I guess it's a bit of a cliche, but be brave. Don't be afraid to try something and to learn. If you're a small organization thinking about digital fundraising, put aside a couple of $100, put aside a couple of, $1,000 or so, just test and see where you get. There's going to be people out there where your message will resonate. If you're a good fundraiser, if you developed a good proposition, it's going to work. So just be brave and don't be afraid to try it. That
is a perfect way to end. I'd like to say a huge, massive, enormous thank you to all of our panelists today, to all of you conference attendees who have come to the sessions, engaged and asked really thoughtful questions. I hope this Q&A has been helpful. If we didn't quite make it to your question, we had a lot. Please don't be shy. Connect with any of the panelists through the Chaplain York's Connect. Thank you for joining us, and please, during the coming months, take good care.